Beyond the hashtag Jess's fight for real change. The voice on the radio crackled with urgency. Breaking news out of Ferguson, Missouri. The streets are filled with protesters after the shooting of an unarmed black teenager by local police. We're hearing reports of tear gas being used. There's a tense standoff between officers in riot gear and crowds chanting "No justice, no peace." Jess tightened her grip on the steering wheel as she drove through the city, the hum of sirens and the echo of distant chants filling her mind. Her heart pounded as she listened, the same sick feeling of injustice bubbling inside her. It was happening again. Another life lost. Another community pushed to the brink. When she stopped at a red light, Jess glanced at her phone on the passenger seat. The screen was alight with notifications. #Justice for Mike Brown, #Hands Up Don't Shoot, hashtags spreading like wildfire. Her feed was a storm of anger, sorrow, and raw emotion. Images of protesters clashing with police filled her screen, faces contorted in rage and pain. It felt eerily familiar, like a cycle doomed to repeat. The light turned green, but Jess didn't move. A knot of frustration formed in her chest. She had been here before, so many times before. First, it was Trayvon Martin, then Eric Garner. Now, Michael Brown. The hashtags would trend, the outcry would rise, and then it would fade. The world would move on. People would move on. She sighed, shaking off the thought as she resumed driving. But she couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time it happened, she felt the fire of righteous anger flare up in her, only for it to be smothered by the next trending disaster. When Jess arrived home, she tossed her keys onto the kitchen counter and sat down at her desk, pulling up her laptop. She scrolled through social media, post after post about Ferguson, people reposting the same infographics, the same petitions. It all felt painfully familiar. Jess wanted to care, to be part of the movement like she had before, but the fire she once felt seemed dimmer now, almost flickering out. She clicked through a few more posts, her fingers hovering over the share button. But for the first time, she hesitated. Was this really making a difference? She had shared so many posts over the years, signed petitions, and attended online protests. And yet, here she was, watching the same violence play out on the streets of a different city. Jess leaned back in her chair, staring blankly at the wall. She was 25 now, and the same questions gnawed at her that had started creeping in a few years ago. Where was the change everyone had fought so hard for? It felt like she had been running in place, stuck in the same cycle of online outrage followed by collective amnesia. A little about Jess. Jess was a freelance graphic designer. Her work allowed her the flexibility to spend hours online, following the latest social justice causes and trends, and it was a world she had once immersed herself in. She could work on a client's logo one minute and be sharing a petition the next. That constant connection gave her a sense of being in the know, of always being on the cutting edge of activism. At 25, Jess was idealistic and introspective, constantly reevaluating where she stood in a world that was always demanding more of her attention. She craved meaning, searching for something bigger than herself. But with every scroll of her newsfeed, she felt more overwhelmed. How could she fight for climate justice, police reform, LGBTQ+ rights, immigration reform, and economic inequality all at once? There were so many battles to fight, and it seemed like everyone was looking for the next viral cause, the next big hashtag, to feel relevant. Deep down, Jess believed in the power of social justice. She believed in fighting for marginalized communities, in amplifying voices that were too often ignored. But what disillusioned her was how quickly people moved on once the hashtags lost their heat. It seemed like every month brought a new disaster, a new injustice, and yet, for all the noise online, very little seemed to change. Her phone buzzed. Another notification, another petition. Jess sighed, rubbing her temples. This was the conflict that weighed heavy on her heart. How could she make a real impact in a world that treated activism like a trend? She wanted to be more than just another voice in a digital echo chamber. Jess's internal conflict gnawed at her daily. She had once been proud of the time she spent advocating online. She had been there, on the front lines of every major movement since she was in college. But now, years later, it all felt hollow. Social media was an endless cycle of outrage, a performance of wokeness that rarely translated into action. Everyone, including herself, seemed to be what she once heard called a weekend warrior for social justice. It was easy to post about injustice for a day, feel righteous, and then go back to life as usual. She thought back to the George Floyd protests in 2020, how she had marched in the streets, shouting until her voice was hoarse. She had felt like part of something big, something that would change the world. But now, in 2024, police brutality hadn't stopped. Another unarmed black man had been killed just last week, yet the uproar seemed quieter, muffled. The fire that had once burned inside her now felt like a flicker, threatened by the endless barrage of new crises. The constant shift in focus from one issue to another made her feel like she was drowning in causes without making a dent in any of them. Jess leaned back in her chair and looked out the window. Being a weekend warrior wasn't enough anymore, not for her. She had spent so much time sharing and tweeting, but what had she done in real life? The guilt gnawed at her. She had the luxury of logging off, of retreating from the world's injustices, but many people didn't. The ones suffering didn't get to scroll past the issues. They lived them every day. That evening, Jess's phone lit up again. Another school shooting, this time in Georgia. 2 students were dead, several others injured. She blinked at the headline, her thumb hovering over the share button, but she didn't click it. How many times had she shared this exact same story? How many times had she posted "enough is enough," demanding stricter gun control laws, only for nothing to change? Her chest tightened. She remembered attending a vigil years ago after another school shooting, lighting candles with hundreds of others as they stood in silence. But what had come of it? The laws hadn't changed. The violence hadn't stopped. She felt herself drifting back into the same familiar frustration, the helplessness, the feeling that her efforts were nothing more than a drop in an ocean of problems. What was she really doing to change the world? Could she be more than just an armchair activist? That night, Jess couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with thoughts of all the causes she cared about: police brutality, climate change, immigration reform, gun control. They swirled around in her head, each one demanding her attention. But how could she focus on all of them? Was it even possible? The next morning, as she sat with her coffee, Jess had an epiphany. She had been so focused on the grand global scale of activism that she had forgotten the power of local, real-world engagement. Social media had numbed her, made her feel like sharing a post was enough. But it wasn't. The true fight wasn't on her phone, it was in her community. She pulled out her laptop and began researching local organizations. There were bail funds she could support, community gardens she could help maintain, voter registration drives that needed volunteers. There were real people doing the hard, quiet work of change, work that didn't come with viral hashtags or retweets but mattered all the same. Jess took a deep breath. This was how change happened, she realized. Slowly, steadily, beyond the screen. She picked up her phone, not to scroll, but to message her friends. "We need to do more," she typed. "Let's get involved for real." For the first time in a long time, Jess felt hopeful. Social media might start the conversation, but real change would happen because people like her refused to stop fighting, even when the cameras weren't watching. This story illustrates that real change isn't about how loud your voice is on social media or how many hashtags you post. It's about showing up consistently, even when the world stops watching. True activism is a long, difficult road that requires persistence, dedication, and action beyond the screen. While raising awareness online can start conversations, meaningful progress happens through sustained engagement, by working with communities, building relationships, and addressing issues at their roots. Social media can amplify a cause, But real change comes when people step away from the digital world and do the hard work to make a difference in their everyday lives. Jess learns that contributing to a cause means committing to the small, often unseen efforts that lead to lasting impact, rather than just engaging when it's trending.